The topic of today's panel is threats and opportunities in the Eastern Mediterranean. This is sort of the essay prompt for our policy project, which Ambassador Edelman and General Wald co-chair, in which Svante plays an integral role. We want to take a broader look at a region that we feel has received underwhelming interest from American strategists and other thinkers. And this embraces a range of issues, as Mike mentioned in his opening comments, Greece, but also obviously the elephant in the room, Turkey. And that's where I want to start with the panel today. And I'll pick up where Senator Graham left off at the dinner last night, where he said, basically, before Congress goes on Christmas recess, Congress will reach a point where they will either decide to lift sanctions on Turkey or, quote, throw the hammer down. Senator Graham ended on those somewhat ominous words, so I figured we'd pick back up there. And I'll start off, Ambassador Edelman, addressing the question to you, but then open it up to the rest of the panel. And it's a pretty straightforward question. Are the U.S. and Turkey headed for a rupture?
Well, I think the answer to that is basically yes. I mean, and we've been headed there for a long time. It won't come as any secret to this audience, because I've addressed this group multiple times over the last few years, and my message, I think, has been fairly consistent, that we were headed towards this kind of train wreck in the relationship, and I think we're now perilously close to that train wreck happening. I think one of the reasons for this that we don't give enough attention to, and I'm very glad Svante is on the panel for that reason, is that there really is not a Turkish foreign policy. I mean, to the degree that President Erdogan, who really is the only important decision maker in the Turkish system, given the nature of the personalistic regime that's been created there, to the degree that he makes decisions about things like the military incursion into Rojava or the purchase of S-400s, it's almost all driven by Turkey's domestic political situation and the requirements that he faces as he tries to solidify this personalistic authoritarian regime and guarantee his own and his family's personal survival and political survival. And so I think it's very important to focus on that piece of it. My understanding of the meeting that took place in the Oval, and Senator Graham would obviously know better because he was one of the 5 members of the Senate who participated in it, but from what I've heard from that meeting, President Erdogan was given sort of 3 choices about what to do with the S-400, which is going to be the precipitating event here, because it is the purchase of the S-400 by Turkey from Rosaboronexport, which is sanctioned under CAATSA, which is the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act that was passed a couple of years ago. That transaction is the one that is sanctionable, and President Erdogan was told, you can either take these S-400s, and I defer to General Wald, who can explain why the U.S. Department of Defense is so concerned about Turkey purchasing equipment from Russia and the role that the S-400 can play in compromising the F-35, which is the 5th generation fighter aircraft that the United States has been building with a number of allies, including Turkey, who was a participant and partner in the program. But the choice that Erdogan was given was he could destroy the S-400s, which is a $2.5 billion purchase. He could turn them over to us at Incirlik so that the United States appropriate authorities could have a look. Or he could keep them in the crates, not turn them on, not turn the radars on, and purchase Patriot. My view is he will not do any of those things. And that means that the Congress is going to be faced with a choice of either sanctioning this activity or not. And I think there's an enormous danger that has not been discussed enough, that if they don't do this, then it's going to open the floodgates to a lot of other people buying S-400 who we would prefer not do that, including India. That's a potential purchase that might happen. Sanctioning Turkey could be a big disincentive to people pursuing that, and I don't think it's a capability we want to see proliferated, particularly to countries with whom we want to work.
Svante, I want to jump over to you very quickly. Ambassador Edelman, I think, made a very interesting statement that there is no real Turkish foreign policy. This is all rooted in Turkey's domestic policy. Could you sort of elaborate on that a little bit for our audience to give a better understanding of what drives Erdogan's manifest hostility toward, let's call it broadly, the West?
How much time do I have? Well, good morning, everyone. I think there is no short answer, but there are a number of things. One is that Mr. Erdogan really comes from an ideological background that is heavily anti-Western and comes from a traditional Muslim Brotherhood-style Islamist environment. And I think that's the fact that we can never lose sight of. On the other hand, he's also a very political animal. He's a very successful political figure, I have to say. He survived a lot of crises in his years in power in Turkey. And he did that because he has this ability to take one step back in order to hopefully take 2 steps ahead again. And we see, however, I think the real underlying story is that there's always a kind of crisis going on. He's never succeeded in really consolidating his power in Turkey, among other because, I agree with Ambassador Edelman that in the Turkish political system, he is the overarching figure. But if you look at Turkish society as a whole, you've seen in the past 3 or 4 years, increasingly, I would argue, a repudiation of Erdogan's plan, of Erdogan's agenda for Turkey. We saw this in the Istanbul mayoral elections, for example. But we see it my favorite example is the fact that in Turkey, Erdogan has tried for a number of years now to transform traditional secular schools into Imam Hatip schools, which are religious schools. And if you send your kids to some of those schools, you have half the amount of students per teacher and the facilities are much better and so on. Still, even in the conservative areas, Sunni conservative areas of Turkey, parents refuse to send their kids to these Imam Hatip schools because they know that in a modern economy, this is not what's going to create success for your family. And on a political level, we've also seen that Erdogan is not able to win elections anymore. In order to safeguard his regime, he had to tone down a bit of his Islamism and move in a heavily nationalistic direction, co-opting the Nationalist Action Party. And still, even with that, he faces a hard time winning elections. And I think this poses both threats and opportunities. But the opportunity, I think the way I look at it is, how can we somehow safeguard a relationship with Turkey for the long run while trying to drive a wedge between Erdogan and the rest of Turkey. But as far as the rupture goes, I agree with the ambassador that this is where we're heading. It would take a lot of deft diplomacy on both sides to avoid it, and I don't think we have that on either side right now. But I think that the last point I'd like to make on this is that one of the reasons why Erdogan is moving ahead the way he is with S-400s, with Syria and everything else is that from day one, he's really thought that he can both make Turkey a more Islamist and essentially anti-American power and maintain his relationship with the United States and evade any kind of consequences for it. Under the Obama administration didn't give him any reason to think that that basic idea was wrong. And unfortunately, I have to say that the Trump administration continues. I mean, the Syria is a perfect example where Erdogan believes if you just push far enough, the Americans will fold.
Thank you, Svante. General Wald, I'd like to jump back a little bit to an issue that Ambassador Edelman first brought up, and that's the problem of the S-400. Beyond simply the fact that the S-400 is a Russian system and the F-35 is a system built by America and its allies, what are the concerns, technical, strategic, otherwise, of Turkey possibly having both the F-35 and the S-400?
Yeah. First of all, I love listening to both these guys. They know what they're talking about. So I'm just a military, kind of simple numbers guy. Kind of go back to General Amador's point, which I thought was really, unfortunately at the end of the discussion, but important. And that was that the decision made in 2006 by Israel has paid big consequences. in the future. Tough decision. I wasn't there. It was hard. Matter of fact, one of my friends was leading the military then, Danny Halutz, and there was a lot of criticism of Danny. But the decision, to kind of stop where they did in Lebanon has kind of carried on over the last 12, 13 years and made a big difference. If you look at things like the S-400, and it isn't just a simple surface-to-air missile capability. It's an intelligence gatherer. It sucks up all these electrons. For those that think the F-35 is an airplane, you're wrong. It just happens to have wings on it. It's a flying computer for all practical purposes. It's beyond anything you could imagine, and we can't even talk about it. There's an airplane called the F-22 that's supposedly the most outstanding airplane in the world. The F-22 pilots tell me they don't want to go to war without the F-35, period. They won't do it. So the F-35 is a huge game changer. And so the S-400, there's a whole bunch of things. One is just the policy side, the impression that you can kind of get your equipment wherever you want and it doesn't matter. But in this day and age, the way we're going to fight wars is mainly the biggest issue is information management and control. And whoever has the high ground on information knowledge, intelligence, electrons, is going to win the war. And you're going to integrate all these systems to win. So that's the number one reason. And then there's a philosophical side too. I mean, seriously, Turkey's a NATO ally, and we're going to buy weapons from probably the largest NATO enemy we have, if you want to call it adversary. Don't call it enemy, that's not polite. But, and you look back on Erdogan, the point made by Svant, when he was elected, he couldn't take office. He was a convicted felon because of his wife wearing the scarf. Now, that's not a real great crime, but it kind of showed your colors. And if you start adding up all the different things that Turkey has done since his election that have gotten in the way of what we do as a U.S. military in our interests, it starts becoming pretty daunting. I mean, right off the bat, he couldn't take office, which was a big, huge issue. Then the Turks had a vote in Parliament right after his election about whether the United States could use the Northern Corridor for the invasion of Iraq in 2003. They lost the vote. And we had paid $350 million to upgrade roads in northern Turkey, or southern Turkey, to bring in the fourth ID through Eskadrin. And Erdogan said, no, not going to override Parliament. You can go south. They had to go back through the Suez Canal, all the way around to Bahrain and drive it up there from there. He stopped us from flying after the coup for a week. He's intervened many times for us to stop flying in Incirlik. The President of the United States made an interesting announcement the other day that, I know that you probably shook your head a little bit when you heard it, but we've always had a kind of a double denial about nuclear weapons any place. We don't confirm or deny. The President announced we have nuclear weapons in Incirlik. So it's fair game. We got to get them out of there. They're not going to let us use those. Against who? Russia. Why should we be there? So I think you start adding these things up, there's a whole bunch more, and you go back and you say to yourself, is it melancholy because we wish it would go back the way it is, or it was, that Turkey is going to become some kind of super NATO ally, that everybody in good standing is going to be a big partner and friend of ours? I don't think it's going to happen. And I'll finish with, people say, well, Erdogan's not going to be in office forever. They used to say it about Robert Mugabe. 40 years later, he finally croaked. I mean, he could be there a long time. So I think we ought to start thinking seriously about this melancholy about the NATO alliance in Turkey. And we ought to start thinking seriously of whether they should be a member in good standing.
Well, General Wald, I think that's preempts perfectly the question I was going to ask you, Ambassador Edelman, which is America's problem with Turkey, is it Erdogan, or does it go deeper? Is this a larger problem with the way Turkey is heading?
Well, I think we need to remember what Svante said correctly, which is Turkey is a very deeply divided society. And I think it's fair to say, Svante, correct me if you think I'm wrong, but that he has never really spoken for more than 50% of the society. I mean, you could argue that technically, in his first presidential election, against Ihsanolu. He got 52%, I think. But it was, by Turkish standards, a relatively low turnout. It was down around 81, 82%. They've got mandatory voting in Turkey, so we would love to have 82% turnout in our country, but it's actually low by Turkish standards. And so he never really had more than 50% of the population on his side. And while I agree with Chuck that we shouldn't kid ourselves, and he might be there for a very long time unless his stomach cancer returns, but we ought to try at least, I think, to play a long game and hope that we can outlast him before he does too much damage. And that's really the kind of two time clocks that are running here, because he is the biggest problem, I think. But it's not just him, it's also the party and political movement he represents, both in terms of political Islam, but also what I think some people have called Islamo-nationalism, this fusion that Svante was talking about, that he has put together of extreme nationalist sentiment, which is quite high in Turkey, and Islam. And he's been pouring poison into the body politic about the United States. He and his allies, his cronies, those who control the press, have been pouring poison into the body politic for almost 2 decades now. And so a lot of this anti-Americanism is just sort of starting to leach into the system. I still think there's a way to kind of get this back a bit. There are now some signs of incipient fragmentation in the AK Party, which is a result to some degree of the political forces that Svante was describing, the defeats in the municipal elections, and as a result of that, the declining ability of Erdogan and his cronies to skim wealth off the most productive parts of Turkish society, which is to say that he no longer controls municipalities that produce about 70% of Turkey's wealth. So his ability to essentially collect rents from the economy, which is what he's been doing to finance his political machinery, is declining. You see the former Deputy Prime Minister and former Treasury Minister Ali Babacan, who I will say, when I was ambassador, was probably intellectually the most impressive minister in that government, is starting his own party and clearly more oriented towards the West and the United States than Erdogan. I don't think we should give up the ghost yet on this, but we should be realistic that it's going to take a while, that it's going to take a lot of effort by the United States, and that we have to get away from the point that Svante made correctly, which is we have operated, I think, on 2 sort of axioms for most of the last 20 years. One is Turkey is too big an ally to fail. And the other is if we keep treating them like an ally, eventually they'll act like one. And this is sort of Einstein's, definition of insanity. How many times do you have to repeat the same thing and get the same result before you ultimately realize that it's not going to get you where you want to go? So the idea that they can act with impunity has got to be broken, and that's one reason why I think it's so important that we do move forward with sanctions. Erdogan has made a bet, and it's been, as Svante said, through 2 administrations, that he could forge a personal relationship with the President of the United States that would be a get-out-of-jail-free card for him. For most of the Obama administration, it was until the last year or 2 when relations really soured a lot. I would say a lot of that was under the influence of then Secretary of Defense Ash Carter, who actually very smart guy who doesn't brook nonsense with people, and I think was very tough on Turkey and had a very good assessment based on my personal conversations with him of where Turkey was headed. But he's made the same bet with President Trump, and so far that bet has paid off for him. And so we have to break that cycle. Now the danger that I think we have here is that someone quoted Senator Graham, I think it was you, Jonathan, who said that Congress is going to put the hammer down. That sort of fills me with a little bit of anxiety because Congress, when it gets in its head to act sometimes does not do it with the most deft touch. And to me, what makes sense here is to use CAATSA, which is the instrument at hand for sanctions, to focus on the transaction that is sanctionable, the people who are engaged in it, the president and his cronies and his family, who, by the way, have been benefiting from all sorts of corrupt activities, but not to make this, as the president did in his tweet after the October 6th phone call with Erdogan, about destroying the entire Turkish economy. Erdogan will try to depict any sanctions as anti-Turkish. And I think we need to make it clear that these are targeted and that they're focused on the AK Party, on Erdogan, the AK Party regime, and his policies. And then I think we need to be prepared for the second shoe to drop, which is Erdogan proceeding with what he has said at the United Nations General Assembly he wants to do, which is essentially to forcibly relocate 2 million Syrian Arab refugees from Turkey to the safe zone, that quote unquote safe zone, that they have created with the military incursion that began on October 9th. I mean, Svante is the historian of Turkey here, so the last time correct me if I get this wrong, but the last time a Turkish government tried to undertake a massive population exchange of this scale into northern Syria was in 1915 with the Armenians, and we know how that worked out. So I think, we're talking here about potentially a humanitarian catastrophe and genocide, and we need to hold something back and this is one reason why I would not proceed with an Armenian genocide resolution right now, but it's something we need to hold back to make clear to Turkey that if they go down this road, they're going to face international opprobrium organized by the United States and very unforgiving sanctions.
Let me make a qualifier. I really respect Ambassador Edelman, and I would defer to him because he's a diplomat, and we operate under civilian control. That's why we have 2 people on this panel. There's 3, but there's 2 co-chairmen. I'd say, I disagree a little bit. First of all, he's a lot more positive and hopeful than I am, and he probably understands it way more than I do. But I'd say it's time for us to make the first step of a 12-step process in recognition. And it's time for us to say, okay, we're going to put heavy sanctions on a NATO ally? Seriously? Okay, I mean, it just seems kind of incongruous to me. But 2 is, I think we need to start developing different alliances. When we were in Greece, as Mike mentioned, Greece is small. It's 1/8 as big as population as Turkey, so it kind of punches a little bit above its weight right now. But there was an exercise off the coast of Greece while we were there with United Arab Emirates airplanes, Israeli airplanes, U.S. airplanes, and Greek airplanes. Seriously? That's pretty interesting. That's kind of an interesting alliance. And so I think it's time for us to start doing a little more of that and put a little pressure on NATO writ large, but Turkey specifically, on the fact that we're not dependent upon Turkey to be successful. What they did to the Kurds, for us that have fought with the Kurds, many of us in here have, is totally distasteful. The Kurds are probably the only stable element in that whole region that we could depend on. And Erdogan's preoccupation with the fact that the Kurds are all terrorists, is crazy. So again, Ambassador Edelman knows way better than I do, and Svante does too, that this is a long game. We had to play it as a long game. But I think we're just giving him so much ground. It's almost embarrassing that we're letting a guy like him actually dictate our foreign policy. It's time for us to stand up to him.
I don't disagree with that. I was still waiting to hear where Chuck disagreed with me, but I agree with all of that, including doing more with Greece, which I think is extremely important and a way of getting Turkey's attention big time. People will notice that in Turkey, and it, I think, is a card we should play, as well as, and both General Wald and I have had this opinion for a while, we ought to be actively looking for alternatives to Incirlik so that we're not held hostage by Turkey over Incirlik. I mean, this again is part of the notion they have that they have us over a barrel, and I think we need to, disabuse them, of that notion. So I actually agree with all of that.
To expand a little bit now, we've been talking obviously mostly about Turkey, but this is a panel about the Eastern Mediterranean more broadly. So Svante, I'd like if you could elaborate a little bit on where Turkey's foreign policy, where its attitude fits in the larger region. Do you explain for people just a little bit some of the broader strategic changes that we're seeing in the region? Svante also joined us on our trip to Greece as part of the Gettler program, along with General Wald earlier this year, where we met with a bunch of Greek officials. And I think it's an underappreciated story, at least here in America, the strategic reorientation that's occurring both around Turkey and because of what Turkey's been doing. Svante, if you could talk a little bit about that.
I think the interesting thing to do is to compare the Eastern Mediterranean today to what it was maybe 15, 20 years ago, when, of course, the big axis in the region was a Turkish-Israeli alignment. It wasn't quite an alliance, but it was clearly an alignment between the two. And that caught the Iranians by surprise, the Syrians by surprise, off balance, and even the Egyptians at the time were not sure what to do with it. Now, suddenly, fast forward 15 years or 20, and we have a completely different situation, which is very much a result of Turkey's attempts to, especially after the 2011 Arab uprisings, to rebuild the Middle East or the Eastern Mediterranean on the basis of a Muslim Brotherhood axis, if you will, that would be former President Morsi in Egypt was part of this. The attempt to get the Muslim Brotherhood to power in Syria was another. You can go to Libya, Tunisia, even Morocco, where Turkey was playing around with this agenda, which failed miserably. But that created a reaction, and that reaction emerged exactly at the same time as the large natural gas reserves of the Eastern Mediterranean were discovered and started coming to market. And Turkey basically suddenly found itself with a alignment against them by everybody else essentially in the region, of course, which meant that partly because of Turkey's own actions and partly because of the economic common interest arising from getting these natural gas resources to market, countries like Greece, Cyprus, Israel, Egypt started, talking to each other, and they found that they had a lot in common. Mostly, of course, opposing Turkish regional ambitions, but also working together to get this gas into the world markets. And I think this is one of the reasons why we see now Turkey, in many ways, is a very defensive actor in foreign policy. It doesn't look that way in Syria, but I think most of what Turkey does, even in Syria, is a result of trying to clean up the mistakes that Erdogan did 10 years ago or 5 years ago. In the case of Syria, when Turkey first tried to get on the bandwagon of getting Assad out of power and replacing him with the Muslim Brotherhood, well, the first thing that Assad did was, oh, really? That's what you want to do? Well, he handed the north of Syria to the Kurds. And Erdogan didn't see that coming. That was just one example, and they've been playing, catch up ever since. And similarly in the Eastern Mediterranean, what you now see is that Turkey basically is trying to say, if I'm not going to have these energy resources, well, nobody's going to have them either. And that's why they're engaging in gunboat diplomacy, buying these and refurbishing these big drilling vessels, and ostentatiously going into the areas of the Mediterranean that are, everybody would agree, part of the exclusive economic zone of the Republic of Cyprus, where, of course, there is an unresolved conflict. And to some extent, they've been successful in delaying or stopping the exploration of these resources.
I mean, it's also worth noting, Svante, I think that Turkey, like the PRC, has enormously expansive legal claims in terms of what counts as continental shelf and therefore Turkish controlled resources as opposed to what everybody else believes.
Yeah, and they also have this idea that, and if you look at the Turkish coast, you see that there are Greek islands all over the place. And therefore the Turks argue that islands shouldn't count when you determine territorial waters, which is kind of an interesting idea that I don't think a lot of other countries agree with. But from one point of view, it's kind of understandable. They have this big coastline, but they have no territorial waters and no exclusive economic zone because all of these Greek islands. And you're seeing a lot of historical revisionism now that says, well, we should never have given away those islands. This was, the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923, which established the Turkish Republic, was always sacrosanct. Nobody in Turkey criticized this treaty. But now Erdogan started doing this, saying, well, Ataturk gave up all these islands that are really ours. And that's a dangerous path to walk down, but that's what's happening.
So I think what we've heard here is obviously partly a painting of increasing hostility from Turkey, and also separately or independently this discovery of great natural gas and potentially other hydrocarbon resources in the Eastern Mediterranean. And this is sort of beginning a nascent strategic reorientation in the region where you have Greece, Israel, and Cyprus, and to a lesser extent Egypt, as Fanti mentioned. So I'd like to sort of just go down the line with one last question before I open it up to audience Q&A, and that's what can the U.S. do to promote stronger cooperation with Greece bilaterally, and or to encourage this new evolving security architecture in the Eastern Mediterranean, where you have Greece and Israel and Cyprus increasingly in close cooperation? Ambassador Edelman, I'll start with you.
Well, I think we can first start to take advantage of the new Greek willingness to do more with NATO and do more bilaterally with the United States military. I mean, this is a big change. I mean, it's certainly a big change from when I was ambassador to Turkey from 2003 to 2005 and going back further. I mean, our relations with Greece, since the return of democracy there in '74 have always been pretty highly charged and dicey. It's now, and our relations with Turkey were in those days much more stable and productive. And now the situation essentially is reversed. But I think we haven't yet taken maximum advantage of all these new opportunities that I think you all found when you had your meetings in Greece. And I think that's the most important thing we can do. And that will be noticed, as General Wald points out, in Ankara. That will definitely get people's attention.
General Wald, is there anything you'd like to add on that score?
No, I totally agree. I think, one thing I think we should consider, and I'm not sure, and some of it may just be a statement, but and they probably can't afford it, but we ought to say, okay, Greece, you're going to get those F-35s that Turkey was going to get, and congratulations, you're now part of our team. I like the air base issue. I like the naval presence. I'd like a little more activity by the Sixth Fleet in that region. I think it goes back to this Russia thing that was articulated by Ambassador Edelman earlier about the importance of Russia there is more symbolic, but it's really significant on the coast of Syria with their ships and airplanes, because now they have a foothold in the Med where they can kind of cruise around out there at will. So I think we need to put some presence emphasis out there, and we ought to start looking at sharing technology with Greece that we aren't going to share with Turkey.
Svante, is there anything you'd like to add as a final point before we turn it over to Q&A?
Well, no, I just add that I think a very important issue to pay attention to is the Turkish-Greek air and naval issues in the Aegean Sea, which was a big issue when I lived in Turkey in the 1990s. You know, they had these gunboat fights over islands, uninhabited rocks, really. Yeah. And that kind of abated for a while, but now we're seeing this come back, which is, of course, related to all these energy discoveries and so on. But I think there is a real, NATO, people say half-jokingly that one of the biggest accomplishments of NATO was to prevent war between Greece and Turkey, two members of NATO. Well, we're back in a situation where I think this is a very real issue that could happen. And what I took away from the trip to Greece was how disturbed and worried and scared the Greeks were of this massive Turkish military investment that, because of their economic crisis in the past 5-10 years, the Greeks have been unable to match, in spite of having some of the highest per capita spending on defense in NATO.
And I'll just remind everyone, as Mike mentioned at the outset, our task force has an upcoming paper that'll be out shortly after Thanksgiving that will examine the various, this strategic reorientation and Greece's almost transformation into a potential U.S. strategic partner in the region, and also providing recommendations for how to bolster that cooperation. Now I'd like to turn it over to Q&A. So if anyone has yes, Dr. Zinberg.
Two questions. General Wald, you alluded to the air base at Incirlik. How important is it that we continue to have that there, particularly considering all the constraints the current government is placing on U.S. activity there? And if we were to close that base, where would you think that we could find another one of equal usefulness? And the second question, really for whoever wants to tackle it, is my understanding of the NATO treaty is that there's no mechanism for people to leave. And if you have a continuing fallout in our relationship between Turkey and the rest of NATO, what's the end game there?
On the first issue, the basing, it sounds complicated and there's some money involved, but it's pretty simple. We can find a lot of bases to operate from. Greek air bases would be good. We could even go into Jordan for that matter. You know, we left Saudi Arabia, went to the Al Udeid. We could leave Al Udeid and go back to Saudi Arabia, which we've done, by the way, a little bit. So
Akrotiri.
Akrotiri, we've used for years anyway. And so location, actually it'd probably be pretty good. But one of the things is your last point about there isn't any mechanism to have somebody go find excellence someplace else out of the alliance, or kick them out for that matter. We can leave there. We'll just leave Turkey. Good luck. We used to have Turkey. Incirlik was important during the Cold War because it was a base that we could launch strikes into Russia, Ukraine, Crimea for that matter. Sevastopol was one of my targets, by the way, during the Cold War. That's not there anymore right now. We don't need that right now. So I think the alternative of not having a mechanism to have somebody leave NATO is we just leave Turkey, and congratulations, you're still in NATO, but we're not operating here. I know it sounds, for people that have been ambassadors and involved with Turkey over the years, again, this is just my personal feeling, but and I know the real politic of it. That's why he's an ambassador and I was just a general. But I think at some point you got to treat the world as it is, not the way you wish it is.
Can I just say, so there is no mechanism for kicking a NATO member out. When I was involved in NATO enlargement in 1996 and 97, I used to joke with my State Department colleagues that we ought to actually have a mechanism for, every new member, we would have to kick one, member out, and actually at that point the French and the Greeks were high on the list. But it does show you that, you want to be careful about this because right now probably the French and the Greeks are two of the better NATO members. So there is, however, a mechanism for countries to leave. So the Turks could leave the alliance if they chose to. You can withdraw. By the way, there's not a mechanism for taking away non-NATO major ally status, which is a designation we give for countries, because when I was undersecretary, I looked into that because I wanted to take it away from Argentina. But it's actually, once you've done it, it's like impossible to unring that bell for some reason that lawyers could explain to me. I couldn't quite figure out. Maybe Jeb knows the answer. I don't know what it was. But Chuck is right. I mean, there are a lot of things we can do short of that to make our displeasure felt. And it ought to start with Incirlik. The one cautionary note I would say about the publicly reported in the press potential presence of nuclear weapons in Turkey. President Erdogan has talked in the last year a couple of times about Turkey developing its own nuclear capability. And Turkey is in the midst of negotiations with the Republic of Korea and Russia to purchase nuclear power stations, and unlike some other countries in the region, Turkey has a actually fairly robust science and technology infrastructure that would allow it, in fact, if it chose to do so. It's a unlike some countries, it is a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, but if it chose to leave the treaty, which is there's a debatable proposition about whether you can leave the non-proliferation treaty or not. But they could fairly rapidly develop their own nuclear capability. I'm very sympathetic to what Chuck was saying about potentially withdrawing those weapons. I guess I'm not ready to pull the trigger on that just yet, because I don't think we want to push them down the road towards developing their own nuclear weapons. But he's right that we may have to face this conundrum, sooner than maybe many of us thought we would have to, about whether we continue to provide a nuclear security umbrella that deters them from pursuing a nuclear capability, or whether that, that cat is just out of the bag.
We have time for one or two more questions. Dr. Violin.
Why would you not want 2 million Sunnites to be returned to their homeland in Syria? I mean, the analogy with the Armenians fails. The Armenians were expelled from their land to move to foreign land. These are Syrians coming back to Syria. They're blowing Assad's throat.
No, I disagree, because first of all, this is not repatriation, this is relocation. These are not people who lived in this part of northeastern Syria. They're mostly people who lived in places like Aleppo and places further to the east, being relocated to precisely the place where the Armenians were located, which is essentially a bunch of desert. And it's being done for the purpose of ethnic engineering. Which is to say, to take an area that's predominantly Kurdish and to create an area that is no longer predominantly Kurdish to suit Erdogan's overriding political objective, which is to prevent a autonomous, self-governing Kurdish entity from emerging on Turkey's border, despite the fact that there have been not one documented case of, notwithstanding all of his screaming about terrorism on the part of the YPG. There hasn't been one single documented attack into Turkey from this part of Syria since 2011. General Wald mentioned how we ought to be pushing back on Erdogan's characterization of the Kurds. We ought to point out when he says that we're getting into bed with terrorists. I mean, I don't think we should, kid ourselves. The YPG is a wholly owned subsidiary of the PKK, which we have designated as a terrorist organization. It's the Syrian branch. But we probably should point out to him that he's the one who sat down with Abdullah Öcalan, the head of the PKK, to negotiate about the Kurdish issue in 2014, and only broke that off when it no longer suited his domestic political purpose and he had to make other accommodations to the military and others.
I think we can squeeze in one more last question. Yes, sir, up front.
Is the military out of domestic politics forever, or do you see a resurgence of their traditional role?
In Turkey?
On, yeah,
I'm very interested in whether Svante agrees or disagrees with what I'm about to say about this. So, and he and I have not concerted our views here. So. First, I think there's been a tendency to depict the 2016 coup attempt in Turkey as a coup that was run by the gang that couldn't shoot straight, and it was terrible, and that it showed the massive development of Turkish civil society, which has sort of inoculated Turkey against the kind of military coups we've seen in the past. My view is it was a much closer run thing than that. We don't know very much about the coup because the government has not really given a full accounting what's happened, because they've had all the legal proceedings basically in secret. And to the degree that anything has come out, a lot of it are statements by people who are clearly subject to coercion and torture. So there's still a lot to learn and understand about that coup. Having said that, I think there's some reasons to believe that the coup came a little bit closer to succeeding than people realized. Had a couple of things fallen into place, this could have gone a very, very different way, point one. Point two, the military fractured in July 2016 roughly the same way that the society is split. The society, as we said earlier, is deeply divided, kind of 50-50, and the military fractured, I would say, pretty close to 50-50. There were some people who hated Erdogan so much that they threw in kind of their lot with the Gülenists, who were the force that was organizing the coup. The other half of the military hated the Gülenists, who were responsible for a lot of the trials that had subjected hundreds of Turkish senior military officers, including many that General Wald and I knew and worked with closely, to a bunch of fabricated show trials. And they hated the Gülenists so much that they threw in their lot with Erdogan. And that was the fracture point. I think there's still a lot we don't know about the military in Turkey. I don't think Erdogan is completely out of the woods yet. I think he doesn't think that. I think one of the reasons he is bound and determined to procure S-400 air defense missiles is precisely to use them against F-16s and F-35s if they ever get them, because he's afraid of his own Air Force. And I don't think one can rule out that you might find a coup brewing that we don't know about, because it's pretty much like the coup in 1960, which was not conducted by general officers, but officers at the 06 level. I don't know.
Well, I think I agree with you, Ambassador. I think the way I would look at it, while agreeing that there's a lot we don't know about the Turkish military, you can talk a lot to retired military officers, but the military itself is almost like a closed box. But it seems clear that there is no love lost for Erdogan within the military. There's a tactical alliance between the higher echelons of the military and with Erdogan. They agree on certain things, such as going after the Gülen movement, such as the Syria issue, which is bringing them together. But they remember that it was Erdogan who negotiated with the PKK and who made possible basically the creation of this Kurdish entity in Syria. That wouldn't have happened otherwise. There are many things, including domestic politics, and the fact that Erdogan, of course, was, as was mentioned here, allied with the Gülenists, and they jointly worked to purge the military out of the state establishment. So, given that we know that, I think very much we should never exclude the possibility that at some point in the future, if there is an internal convulsion in Turkey, that the military could step up again and engage in various activities, including a possible coup against Erdogan. It's not going to happen anytime soon, but I think we couldn't rule it out.
Would they be allied with the U.S.?
No, right now what happened, because the Gülen movement portrayed themselves as the pro-American force within the military, right now the nationalists in the military are very much driving in this relationship with Russia and even with Iran. So within the Turkish military, we have a lot of work to do to restore our relationship.
I think on that note, which is a relatively upbeat one after our first panel,
All relative.
please join me in thanking our panelists.